Dead by Daylight now has 40 playable killers with its newest addition to the killer family, the Krasue. And with the influx of newer players entering the fog through the FNAF collab, the Ghoul, or even the Krasue, looking through 40 killers might feel slightly overwhelming. Have no fear though, for I, a certified fellow, somewhat beginner, will be going through each and every killer today to help you get started on the right path for you, or maybe even help you find your first killer main. When I mention accessibility, I'm specifically mentioning things such as how simple it is to understand a killer's power, how forgiving it is to make mistakes, whether you can still feel impactful while learning, and how fun I found them. So that's exactly what I'll be judging these killers on, their simplicity and their effectiveness / impactfulness, as killers such as Trapper, for example, are incredibly straightforward, but might not be as game-changing as others. Most importantly to note, I'm approaching each killer at complete face value, as most of these killers have so much potential regarding their powers, and I personally feel it would make things most fair. As last time, I will also be going through each killer in complete random order to hopefully keep things fresh and unpredictable. Do keep in mind that everything mentioned in this video is completely subjective. Everything I might mention about a certain killer might not necessarily apply to you, as we might have different playstyles. So definitely make sure to do more research beyond this video to see what fits you best, as I'd hate for you to potentially purchase a killer and end up disliking it. Also, make sure to join the Discord that just opened a few days ago. There's already so many lovely people in there, and I'd love to see more of you beautiful people join. But with all that said, I will stop yapping now. If you have any video ideas at all, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comments or in the Discord. Thank you all so much for your support, and let's get into the list! The first killer I'll be talking about on this very lengthy list is the Dredge. Honestly, I struggled immensely with the Dredge until discovering what returning to the Remnant did, because I never had a singular clue as to what exactly that meant. I genuinely thought he was a completely straightforward M1 killer whose power is teleporting to lockers and causes your screen to suddenly turn completely dark. To those unaware of the returning to Remnant, essentially when pressing and holding right click, you leave a small black blob or fog behind you which you can teleport back to. That's where my issues arise regarding the Dredge, that I personally had to actually search things up in order to fully understand his power. His teleporting, while deadly against newer survivors, can also become incredibly predictable against experienced ones, and they will, for example, fake vaulting windows when you're quite a distance away and would use the teleportation to catch up. That's why I honestly really struggled placing Dredge, because against newer players, which is what some of you will be playing against depending on your MMR, you have that deadliness of the locker teleportation that unfortunately can become predictable. And if you're unaware of the returning to Remnant, you're missing out a key part of his kit without even realizing it. That could undoubtedly be a complete me issue though, being too eager to dive straight into playing without even reading the killer's power. So for accessibility, I'm placing Dredge within the B tier. Strong potential, but only if you actually understand the power. Following the Dredge, we have the Onryo. As some of you might already know, I absolutely adore Sadako with an immense passion. With that said though, I feel Onryo faces the same dilemma as Dredge, where I only understood that she can teleport to these TVs, but was completely oblivious to the fact that survivors near you, when you're teleporting, are affected with the condemned status. If I told you I understood that when looking at the survivors' in-game icons too, I'd be absolutely lying to you. For those unaware, the condemned status is something that has to stack, meaning you need to teleport around the survivors multiple times, and when it's full, you can outright mori them. That again required me to search up guides to fully understand what her power fully did. Her teleportation can undoubtedly swing a bunch of pressure onto the survivors, but even then do I barely reach full condemned status onto them, ending up in constant 4-man escapes. Of course, complete skill issue on my end without a doubt, but I think sharing my perspective is valuable to those who are either new or seeing what a newer Onryo experience is like. As mentioned, her teleportation can definitely swing pressure, but if you don't understand the condemned status at all, she's simply another M1 killer with a fancy teleport. This makes me feel inclined to place her in the B tier as well. Next on our list, we have the Executioner. Obviously, our first experiences with each killer heavily differs. Some are obviously positive and some are negative. My experience with the Executioner undoubtedly falls within that positive list, where he might honestly be in my top 5. Everything regarding his power at face value is extremely easy to understand. Controlling it for the first time feels a little wonky because you're obviously not used to it, but I personally got the hang of it incredibly quickly. To me, he also feels very forgiving when making mistakes. I haven't had a chase where I missed my power and felt like, ah damn, everything is ruined now. Obviously you're going to miss, and I missed a bunch when first starting out, but still performed completely fine. It's also very helpful how when survivors run through your trail, there's that heartbeat effect, which can come in really handy as well when aiming your power. All in all, you definitely do not need a deep understanding whatsoever to get the hang of him, and you most certainly don't need to search anything up. I am very proud and happy to say that I'll be placing Executioner in the S tier. The next killer is the Xenomorph. During my very first game playing Xenomorph, I had absolutely no idea how to enter the tunnels. I am not even kidding. I knew you could enter them, but actually doing so was impossible. It's literally just a matter of pressing space as well, so that's completely my fault. For me personally, while Xenomorph is undoubtedly really enjoyable to play as, I struggled immensely with applying any pressure onto the survivors. I felt quite overwhelmed having to deal with the flamethrowers at first to prevent my power from going away, then the power itself. At least the aiming part didn't feel super intuitive at first either. Unless the survivors were completely new to the game, I always got completely wrecked. That said though, you also don't need any external guides to get the hang of everything Xeno has to offer at face value. Maybe like 2 to 3 games, at least in my personal experience. What is incredibly useful though about Xenomorph is when exiting your tunnel, if any survivor is nearby whatsoever, you'll be notified very clearly through heartbeats and everything, allowing you to instantly turn onto anyone nearby. I am a huge fan of that specifically. You also don't feel punished for making mistakes either, like missing your shots, because of the fact that you can shoot again pretty quickly and everything. I'd like to think that Xenomorph could be another solid B tier. Next up, I'll be talking about the Mastermind. He's another one of those killers where, despite my super low skill level, he's incredibly awesome to play. His dashes are super easy to understand. It definitely requires some patience here and there instead of, you know, immediately flying everywhere, but that'll definitely just come instinctively. While missing his power is definitely not the end of the world whatsoever, the immense slowness you're in gives the survivors the perfect opportunity to rebuild that distance you intended on closing with your dashes or even extend it. So chases might take a little longer than you'd actually wish for, but all in all, the power is super straightforward and easy to understand. What I will say, and I'm honestly unsure whether this even matters a whole lot, is that if you were to ask me what the circles that appear around the survivors' icons meant, I genuinely would not be able to tell you. I think if it fully becomes red, the survivors become slower, and that's obviously why the spray is there, but honestly, that never affected my ability to play him or get value from his power, so it's definitely not a deal breaker. In my personal experience, I also felt really impactful with Wesker. I was applying tons of pressure onto survivors, and he's overall an absolute blast to play, and I definitely recommend him. Wesker absolutely deserves the S tier with the Executioner. Following the Mastermind, we have the Trickster. The Trickster is an incredibly tough case for me personally. His power itself is fully straightforward. You have a large amount of throwable blades that fly incredibly quickly at survivors, and at a certain point you're able to enter a mode where you rapidly throw a bunch of those blades. So in that regard, he is accessible because the power itself is intuitive. So in that regard, he is accessible because the power itself is intuitive. However, actually aiming the blades has always been an immense challenge for me, even with an FPS background. And you can even see that I'm missing so many of my blades. I also really struggle with the fact that he becomes so slow when throwing them too. It always takes me a significant amount of time to down even just one survivor. What is really cool is that you can actually throw the blades through little holes in walls or terrain to hit survivors, but that is pretty difficult to consistently pull off too, especially when first starting out. You have to be really precise with it. I think overall Trickster is one of those killers who definitely requires tons of practice to really excel at, which has honestly turned me away from him a little bit. Missing blades punishes you quite heavily, I feel, making especially the early game frustrating. So overall, I think I'm going to be placing the Trickster in the C tier because his power in itself is straightforward, it's just everything else is pretty complicated. Actually hitting the blades in quick succession though absolutely feels heavenly. The next killer is the Oni. I'm going to be completely honest here, I don't think I have enough experience on Oni in particular to properly format a super detailed and helpful section, however, I will try my absolute best for you. Starting out, I was absolutely terrified because Oni looked impossible to play, and that was also definitely the case during my first matches. It's actually quite funny because my first 2 matches were absolute disasters, and then my third match, everything just clicked. That said though, his power in essence is straightforward. You M1 survivors, you take their blood, and you become a furious boy and start dashing all over the place and smashing people with your big club. I won't lie, learning the dash and actually bonking people with that massive club was way harder than I expected. I believe it's also quite circumstantial, as obviously maps are different, chases will be different in terms of what tiles you run, etc, etc. Some chases will end in a pinch and it'll feel incredibly satisfying, and others I felt so embarrassed and I wanted to hide in the corner. I think that embarrassment can also definitely turn into frustration early on, which also makes you perform worse, and while missing during your blood frenzy isn't the end, as I said, it does feel a little bit embarrassing, at least for me. Major respect though to the people who have mastered the Oni and hit absolutely mind-boggling things, but I think I'll be placing him in the C tier myself. The next killer is the Plague. She is one of those incredibly straightforward killers in both what the power does and the actual execution of said power. She is, in my opinion, one of the most accessible killers to play as when first starting out because of how simple she really is. You literally just infect survivors when you see them, infect generators when walking by, you can give survivors the broken status through infecting them enough, and if they decide to cleanse themselves, which is highly discouraged, you're able to literally damage them with your power. I honestly don't think you can actually make mistakes with the Plague either. I think most of it comes down to your mechanics in general outside of what killer you're playing. Even if you miss your puke, the cooldown is literally a few seconds, so you can try again so quickly. Aiming it also isn't hard whatsoever, as you can literally just throw it in multiple directions too. I think her pressure is also quite great, getting 3 to 4Ks quite consistently. Survivors are also stuck with the dilemma of whether to cleanse or not, giving them another thing to think about. Yeah, there honestly isn't very much to say regarding the Plague. She is a super beginner-friendly killer with one of the most simple yet effective powers when first starting out. I think I'll be placing her in the S tier. Next up, we have the Hillbilly. It goes without saying that the Hillbilly is another character that requires immense practice to actually excel at. Not even that, he's literally one of the hardest characters in the game. You definitely don't want to enter your first Billy match expecting a 4K. Or even a 1K for that matter. I'm honestly unsure what's received more damage with this character. My already fragile, non-existent ego and confidence, or the walls, or any kind of terrain. Anytime I think I'm finally about to achieve my first stab with the chainsaw, my character suddenly just completely blips to the right or the left into a wall or a tree. I'm honestly quite unsure why that actually happens, like in this following example where I fully charged my chainsaw to break this pallet and I suddenly just fly right into the wall. I genuinely don't think there's much that needs to be said regarding Billy. If you're up for the challenge, then by all means, but I will personally be staying as far away as possible from Billy for the time being. D tier. Following the Hillbilly, we have the Twins. Now the Twins are the complete opposite from the Hillbilly. You're going from an absolute nightmare to the easiest time of your life. I'll explain how the ever so complicated kit of the Twins works as clearly as possible. Shoot out little brother. Little brother searches for survivors. Little brother pounces on survivors. Big sister comes and finishes the job. Congratulations, you've now learned how to play as the Twins! Genuinely, if I'm ever in need of a match where I can simply turn my brain off and go on complete autopilot, the Twins are arguably the best for that. Unlike Hillbilly, where there isn't much that can be said because of how complicated he is, there isn't much that can be said regarding the Twins because of how simple and straightforward they are. They're another one of the most beginner-friendly killers without a single doubt. There's no way I'm putting them anywhere else besides the S tier. The next killer is the Clown, and I honestly also feel very iffy regarding him. Similarly to Trickster, his power is pretty self-explanatory. You have two kinds of throwable bottles, one of which slows survivors when walking through its smoke, and the other one speeds either you or the survivors up depending on who runs through it. But then it's actually using it where I feel slightly unsure. The bottles are thrown much shorter than I actually had expected. Usually I throw them thinking they'll land right in front of the survivors, but instead they're thrown like 5 centimeters in front of me and I want to cry. And throwing them definitely requires decent strategy too, I believe. I usually just kind of spam the bottles and get away with it, but you really shouldn't be doing that, so don't learn from me. I also sometimes struggle with deciding which bottle would be best to use. Sure, at face value, one slows people, the other speeds you up, allowing you to catch up. But as I mentioned before, you can't just mindlessly throw them, you really have to think about it sometimes, and that requires deeper knowledge about the killer, which I obviously don't have. In my personal experience too, I also really struggle struggled pressuring the survivors unless I brought certain add-ons, but even then it does feel quite hard to really get pressure going. So while his power in essence is incredibly easy to understand, the actual execution feels slightly iffy and applying pressure is another tough area. I think I'll be placing the clown in the B tier because he's not as difficult as Trickster. Next up is the Animatronic, and with the huge influx of newer players that arrived along with this collaboration, Behavior definitely succeeded in making sure Springtrap feels perfectly accessible for beginners. You've got the traversable doors located around the entire map for insane pressure and mobility, and when you actually go through the doors, your terror radius is temporarily gone, which can lead to nice jump scares. You've got the hatchet that feels incredibly easy and smooth to use, which can also be seen through walls when stuck on survivors. He is an incredibly beginner-friendly killer without a doubt. I genuinely can't say much about Springtrap because like Plague or Twins, he's super easy and simple to use, and you'll definitely pick up his power perfectly fine within your first game. He also belongs to the S tier. The next killer is the Legion. Now again, the Legion in essence is simple, but everything beyond that is where things get complicated. You're definitely capable of getting in tons of pressure through your frenzy, without a doubt, but how do you finish things off after that? Most of the time, the pressure I apply through my frenzy ends up becoming nullified very quickly. Legion also doesn't have anything in particular that helps with chases either, at least in my experience. I can also imagine them being extremely good when survivors are stuck in 3-gen situations, for example, but apart from that, they really don't do anything for me. Like Clown, I feel like with certain add-ons, the Legion can become really powerful too, but you won't always have those add-ons available, and then what do you do after that? To sum it all up, it's tough to really get any pressure in, they don't have anything that helps them with chases, it's honestly incredibly difficult to get kills or even downs going, so I'm going to be placing the Legion in the C tier as well. Following that, I'll be talking about the Knight. The Knight honestly looked incredibly simple to play from a survivor's perspective, but frankly, that was not the case whatsoever in reality when first trying him. Regarding the guards, which is his power, I had to look through multiple guides to try and understand it, but I am still so confused to this day on how to properly use them, what each of the guards do. It's just a mess for me. The execution of the power is incredibly clunky and I struggle so much with placing the guards down. I don't think there's much positive I can say about the Knight, which honestly makes me really sad. He's amazing when you know how to play him, but from a beginner's perspective, the experience really turned me away from him. I think I'll be placing the Knight in the D tier with the Hillbilly. Next up, we have the Spirit. I mean, what can I say about the Spirit? She has incredible pressure capabilities, she's incredibly mobile with her phasing ability, you can shut down chases in a heartbeat, survivors sometimes have absolutely no clue where you're going to come from, and you absolutely need no extra add-ons whatsoever as her base kit is already immensely powerful. While she is audio reliant when phasing, that in most cases is genuinely not a problem. You can also see scratch marks while phasing, she's all around an amazing killer to play regardless of what skill level you're at. The only minor caveats are that she can sometimes be countered pretty easily through being stealthy, and she requires a bit of mind games as well rather than actually brute forcing everything, but besides that, as I already mentioned, she is incredible. Even first time players will feel impactful playing her. I'll be placing her in the A tier purely because she requires more skill and effort and practice than the killers in the S tier for me personally. The next killer is the Wraith. His stealth is really powerful, allowing you to surprise unprepared survivors and sometimes even get a super early down going. That's definitely happened to me many times where I simply run into a Wraith without even noticing it. Obviously, you can also move around the map super freely because you have no terror radius whatsoever when in stealth form, and the speed boost you receive from uncloaking is another super nice and helpful detail. That said though, he's very tricky mid to late game and his actual looping / chase power is a little iffy. For example, Wraith is often used to block windows during his stealth form. I actually never thought of that myself, I had to search that up. Chases are definitely going to take longer when first starting out, and you can honestly become quite predictable too. I feel that he's also quite reliant on his strong add-ons to really succeed. Not that he's completely unable to succeed without them, but they definitely make a huge difference. I think first starting out, Wraith might be a bit of a weak killer, so for all of that, I think I'll be placing him in C tier. Yes, his power is straightforward, and he's an easy killer without a doubt, it's just that he feels so weak, unfortunately. The next killer is the Doctor. His power can definitely make survivors play very erratically as well as slow things down tremendously as you're disrupting time spent working on generators, healing, etc. But I'm honestly afraid that most newer players will simply spam his shocking abilities without actually fully knowing what they do or how to use them. The shocking is great during loops as you can prevent survivors from vaulting or dropping pallets, but you absolutely need to have great timing for that, which is already a drawback in itself, and you most likely won't even know about that during your first playthroughs. So while you can pressure the survivors quite heavily, everything else beyond that is kind of a big question mark for me. So I'm really struggling on whether he deserves the D tier or the C tier, but he isn't nowhere as bad to play as a beginner as the Hillbilly, so I think I'll be placing the Doctor in a C tier as well. Next up is the Lich. You can fly around the map, you can throw out a large ball that locates survivors for you if they're within that ball, you can pick up dropped pallets or even prevent them from being dropped, you can spawn 3 skeletons that fly through walls and damage survivors. You have so much at your disposal. Obviously every ability goes super deep, but you cannot deny that at complete face value, which is what this entire list is based on, all those abilities are beginner friendly, you're able to apply tons of pressure, chases are usually finished quite quickly, you don't really get punished for making mistakes, he's an all-around great killer when first starting out. I honestly can't find any negatives when it comes to Vecna when first starting out. I've been sitting here thinking as hard as possible, but I cannot think of anything, so I will personally be placing him in the S tier, but let me know what you think. The next killer is the Singularity. I was quite terrified of playing Singularity, which is why I outright refused to play him for the longest time, but I discovered that he genuinely isn't as bad as I thought. He can seem really intimidating with his cameras, the placement of them, actually controlling them, when to use them, but it actually all felt really intuitive for me. You probably cannot get away with the things I do, as experienced players will obviously know exactly what to do, but in my experience, camera placement didn't really matter all that much. He's got immense pressure, being able to teleport to survivors through his cameras, teleporting to survivors during chases outside of cameras when they're affected by slipstream, I think it is, which is basically the blob you shoot at survivors through the cameras. You've got the overclock mode, which basically negates pallet stuns. Survivors are also busy grabbing EMPs rather than working on generators and stuff. I honestly never really ran into any difficulties when playing him. The only real thing is that he requires a bit more skill in general, which is why I'm rather hesitant on placing him in the S tier, because that'd feel slightly misleading, but I will put him in the A tier on my personal scale. Next up, we have the Trapper. Obviously, he is the very first killer in the game, so he's going to have a completely straightforward power. You literally just place traps all around the map, so he is the most accessible in that regard without a doubt. However, you actually have to place the traps in very good locations for them to actually work, and overall they can be incredibly predictable. You also have no mobility whatsoever, and if you decide to place down traps during chases, survivors might be able to take that time to put themselves in a better position. There generally isn't very much to say regarding Trapper. He's the very first killer, so everything is going to be completely basic, but I definitely appreciate what the developers did when creating him. So while his power is absolutely straightforward, it's always been really tough for me to achieve real pressure with him and get any kills, so for that, I think I'll be placing the Trapper in the C tier. The next killer is the Hag. Oh, this killer just really doesn't suit my playstyle whatsoever, really. Everything is incredibly slow but methodical with her, and I'm personally not the biggest fan of that. She's so reliant on setting up her traps before anything else, combined with her already slow movement speed and the amount of map knowledge required because you're essentially wasting time mindlessly placing traps. I overall think that she really struggles from an accessibility standpoint. I believe that especially when first starting out, any mistakes you'll make will be quite fatal, which will obviously also lead to frustration. She's really just another one of those killers where mastery is almost always required to excel, but that's not what we're here for, unfortunately. Similarly to the Legion, I unfortunately can't really find many positives to say about the Hag from an accessibility perspective. I'll be placing her in the D tier. The next killer is the Nightmare. Like Vecna, Freddy also has numerous powers within his kit, but I honestly feel the actual execution of said powers is more complicated than Vecna's. With Vecna, you can easily shuffle between each ability and know exactly what they do, but for Freddy, I honestly felt slightly overwhelmed. For example, with the pallet power where you can place fake pallets and explode them when survivors are near, you actually have to be wary of whether you actually placed a fake pallet or not, and you might start to panic if not. At least that's how I felt. I feel like that's honestly my biggest issue with him is the pallet power specifically. The rest of his abilities, the teleport and the slow, are perfectly fine and easy to use. You can be pretty impactful through your teleport, getting survivors off of generators. The slow and pallet abilities are great chase powers, it's just that the overall ability doesn't feel immediately accessible like Vecna's power does. And I think he's also not as powerful as Vecna for me personally, but Freddy's definitely a solid B tier. Following that, we have the shape. Michael is thankfully another super beginner-friendly killer in terms of his power. You literally just stalk survivors until you eventually reach tier 3, and you're able to insta-down survivors just like that. That's basically how Michael Myers works for you. Pre-update Michael Myers specifically. Before the update, he also didn't have a singular power that actually helped during chases. It mostly depended on your overall skill level in chases and your mind games. So in that regard, I do feel slightly iffy. Also, what they changed about Myers is that when in tier 3 now, you receive a dashing ability similar to the pig, who we'll see later in the list, and only then can you insta-down survivors in tier 3, which is pretty helpful actually. He doesn't have any real mobility outside of that, but that wouldn't really make sense for Michael, now would it? Overall, he's another very solid killer. For me personally, he does belong in B tier solely for the fact that he doesn't feel as impactful as other killers in the higher tiers, but he's absolutely worth picking up in my opinion if you're looking for a killer with a super easy power. Next up, we have the good guy. I personally find Chucky to be another super beginner-friendly killer. While obviously all the powers have so many facets to them and you can become an absolute monster when you master said power, regardless of which killer you're actually playing, and some obviously require more practice to achieve that than others. When it comes to Chucky though, you don't need that mastery whatsoever to succeed. His base power is already strong enough to dominate matches, and if you're able to do basic scampers, which honestly isn't hard either, even better. You're also so small that sometimes tracking Chucky as a survivor during chases becomes pretty difficult. And then we haven't even touched on the third person perspective yet, which is a definite nice change of pace, and makes him even more beginner friendly. Sure, the height could maybe hinder you here and there a little bit, but when looking at Chucky as a whole from a beginner's perspective, I honestly struggle to find any negatives. The only other negative I can really find is that in my experience, having to perform any sharp turns while using his power is a bit tough. But other than that, he's straightforward, it's a little easier to get into the more advanced stuff, and he's also quite fun. I'd personally put him in the A tier just because I never really noticed how tricky it is to sometimes properly use the power when making sharp turns. The next killer is the Skull Merchant. Alright, let's talk about the few positives from a beginner's perspective. First of all, there's no flicking or high precision involved like Nurse, Blight, or Trickster. You're not dashing all over the place, nothing feels uncontrollable, so you're not doing anything super intense mechanically. However, the mental work with Skull Merchant is where everything falls apart. You're micromanaging drones that you have to place correctly or they literally bring no value whatsoever. You're deciding whether to drop a drone mid-chase, figuring out which ones to remove, and you're constantly checking your radar to potentially track survivors as well. On top of that, she's been completely nuked by nerfs, and in her current state, she is not worth picking up, especially for newer players, simply because of how heavy the mental load is. If you're in a 3-gen situation though, play that game like it's your last, because she can absolutely pop off there. But besides that, like I said, I wouldn't recommend her to any newer players starting out, especially right now. She goes in the D tier, unfortunately. This is quite possibly the moment many of you have probably been waiting for. I will now be talking about the Krasue. In the current state that she's in, she's another super accessible killer with many abilities at her disposal, and she's also incredibly impactful. Let's be honest, what doesn't the Krasue have though? You can go into your floating wake form and slither like an absolute maniac across the entire map, which is also incredible for catching up to survivors. You infect the survivors with your spit, which you actually have to hit on the survivors, I noticed, not around them, but it's not that difficult honestly. And then you can perform a super long dash attack on the survivors in your head form. You're also in third person when in head form, also making things even easier. Like, everything about this killer is so easy right now honestly, and I cannot find any negatives about her in this current state that she's in. But I am curious to see how she'll look in the future. It would have definitely been nicer to form a longer section specifically for her, but there's no negatives to talk about right now, and I would just be dragging things on. I'll be placing the Krasue in the S tier without a doubt right now. The next killer is the Nurse, the unanimous GOAT of DBD killers for the longest time. But will she finally be dethroned by the Krasue? One of the absolute best mobility and looping killers within the game, being able to blink/teleport both incredibly far and basically ignoring most tiles. There is a reason so many people dislike her due to how powerful she is. However, she's also one of the most difficult killers without the Plate Flannel add-on, which shows you how far and where you're teleporting. But without that, she is so difficult. There's genuinely nothing much to say regarding the Nurse because everyone knows how difficult she is, especially when you first start out with her. The one thing I would also like to point out, which slightly reduces her accessibility even more, is the fact that with her fatigue, I'm not sure if this still applies today, but there is potential of experiencing motion sickness, or at least there used to be. With all that said, I'll be placing the Nurse in the D tier as well. Following the Nurse, I'll be talking about the Pig. Out of the gate, she's another pretty beginner-friendly killer, but in my personal experience, she hasn't been as immediately impactful as many other killers. Her stealth while crouching is incredibly nice, same with her ambush attack after crouching, but most of the time, I'm unable to even find a decent opportunity to actually use that ambush attack. I usually play her as a completely straightforward M1 killer because by the time you're about to use your ambush attack, the survivors have most likely already saw you and are repositioning themselves. However, she is very accessible in the sense that there's nothing complex going on whatsoever. Her traps are also really solid, which slow down the game quite tremendously, since people are sometimes more occupied taking off those helmets rather than doing generators or healing, meaning you can swing things back onto your side if ever needed. That said though, she doesn't have anything that actually helps and chases, and overall, she's quite weak. Pig has positives and negatives, which is why I feel she belongs in the B tier. She's a very solid killer all around, but not as highly impactful as the rest. The next killer is the Ghoul. I am honestly on the fence with the Ghoul because he's another killer that has very nice positives but also some pretty harsh negatives for me personally. Let's talk about the positives first. Obviously, you've got absolutely insane mobility. This character's mobility is phenomenal. You also receive a free injure where your power literally locks onto any survivor you're aiming at. It's definitely sorta crazy and a little overtuned. However, speaking from personal experience, using the dash in chase really depends on the tile. Sometimes I'm outright embarrassing myself, and other times I'm able to dash so well that I fly right in front of a survivor, blocking them from dropping a pallet. It's been very hit or miss for me personally, and it's also tough to steer properly at times as well. The game punishes you quite heavily too if for any reason you're struggling with your dash. It can be pretty frustrating overall. He's definitely not as punishing as say Nurse or Billy, but he definitely isn't also, you know, pick up and dominate like Chucky or Twins. I think he also lands pretty solidly in the middle for me. B tier. Next up, we have the Cannibal. Bubba's power is fully intuitive and straightforward. You charge your chainsaw, start slashing it around, and you insta-down survivors. Controlling the chainsaw doesn't feel awkward or difficult at all in my opinion. Definitely not like the Hillbilly. Turning while slashing around has never been an issue for me personally, and overall, he's incredibly easy to understand and pick up. Sure, you don't have much mobility to apply pressure across the map compared to other killers, but I think Bubba makes up for that with the insta-downs that feel super satisfying too and rewarding even on your first few games. Obviously, you can't completely turn your brain off like you can with other killers, but I believe that Bubba's simplicity and power make him a great choice for newer players. Because of all of that, I think he belongs in the A tier for accessibility. The next killer is the Unknown. The Unknown is another killer I struggled with in terms of placement. The hallucinations are without a doubt incredible. You're capable of either quickly zooming from one side of the map to the other, you can easily and quickly end chases with them if you're able to redirect survivors into them and they're well placed. There's so many things you're capable of doing with them. The second part of his power, however, which is the blob that you shoot at survivors, is where I've always struggled with the Unknown. I frequently forget it goes through survivors when shooting it, usually ending in the shot missing. Then if I do eventually hit a survivor, I struggle with finishing the job in time before that infection is what I'll call it runs out, which happens when survivors look at you for a certain amount of time, making chases even longer. You can also bounce the projectile off of walls or terrain, which I try to implement as much as possible, but I'm straight up horrible with it. I really struggle with that part of its power, and it doesn't feel super accessible for me personally. I usually end up feeling a little frustrated too because of how much time I waste in chases, unfortunately. If there's one killer I'd love to main though, the Unknown is absolutely one of them, but right now he'll be landing in the C tier on my personal list. Following that, we have the Houndmaster. Based on my personal experiences with her being a pretty average killer player, Houndmaster truly hasn't been bad at all, and I actually enjoy her a bunch. She's got some great mobility when sending the dog towards generators, allowing you to reach survivors pretty quickly. The dog's also incredibly useful to use during chases, and I personally haven't had many issues with the redirect myself. Sure, she doesn't have anything else besides that, but does she really need anything extra? I find that she does a great job overall and feels pretty accessible. I will say that though, obviously that poor dog has been through so much with how buggy it truly is, and I can also definitely see that the redirect isn't the easiest thing to hit either, especially when you have to perform it quickly. But yeah, I think she's another pretty solid killer. I'll be placing her in the B tier though, and not higher, because I don't think she's as oppressive as the killers in the higher tiers. The next killer is the Huntress. On paper, Huntress seems pretty beginner friendly. You throw hatchets either from afar or up close during chases, reload when empty, M1 occasionally if or whenever necessary, and boom! But it's not as simple as that in practice. Her slower movement speed makes things feel quite sluggish, and actually hitting hatchets under pressure is harder than it might seem, especially for beginners I think. However, the hatchets are thankfully not as dreadful to use or aim as Trickster's blades by a mile. Compared to Trickster, I believe beginners will have a much better experience playing Huntress, at least in my experience. She's another pretty basic killer really, so there isn't very much I can comment on regarding Huntress, but she's very solid and will be placed in the B tier. The next killer I'll be talking about is the Blight. Blight's a killer who feels incredible in the hands of a very experienced player. I think everyone, or at least most people, can attest to the fact that when first starting out with playing Blight, how do I word this? You're going to be bumping into literally everything, which is what Blight does, but not the good kind of bumping where you're setting yourself up for an insane hit. The amount of times I found myself in tight-ish loops, I try using my power and I just bash my head into the same thing like 5 times, and I start to think to myself, yeah, I really played some mind games there. And then I'm flying towards a survivor, and then they just slightly turn to the right or to the left, and I just fly past them. I know I'm completely memeing right now, but it's because there's literally nothing to say regarding accessibility. He's another one of the least accessible killers, but he is genuinely so fun, so the struggle is absolutely worth it without a doubt. Blight will unfortunately fall in the D tier though. The next killer is Ghostface, another stealth killer who is thankfully another one of the more accessible killers on the list. His concept is fully straightforward. Just like Myers, you enter stealth mode, crouch around, hide behind terrain, and stalk survivors until their exposed meter fills up so you can insta-down them. There is nothing complex or fast-paced going on, which makes him even more beginner-friendly. That said, staying hidden isn't always as easy. Survivors can reveal you just by looking at you, forcing you out of your power, so positioning is key. Beyond that, he doesn't have much else going on, but like Myers, that's just Ghostface. Adding more to his kit wouldn't really make any sense. He's a straightforward killer with a simple power who works incredibly well. I'll be placing him in the A tier and not S tier purely because I'm unsure if he's as oppressive as those killers. Next up, we have the Dark Lord. Dracula's a killer with a lot going on, but that doesn't necessarily make him inaccessible. His bat form is super easy and intuitive. You literally just fly around and you can even teleport to windows or vaults. Super great for mobility. His human form I struggle with a tiny bit, mostly because the placement of the flames have to be pretty precise, and I always feel like I need to predict the survivor's movement. Then there's a wolf form, which can also be a little tricky to land hits with, but you can definitely get used to everything after just 1 or 2 games, so it's not that big of a deal, honestly. However, since his kit can feel a little complex and might overwhelm beginners, and because predicting movement and hitting with the wolf form takes some practice, I think Dracula fits well in the B tier for my list. Still, he's a super solid killer and really fun overall. The next killer is the Deathslinger. I'm feeling a little iffy regarding him honestly. His shots are pretty easy to miss in my opinion, especially when you're going through so many different tiles, and that can become very frustrating very quickly. Even with an FPS background, the dynamics between DBD and other games feel completely different, and my skills definitely didn't cross over at all. A few bad shots can also really ruin your momentum and delay chases immensely because you obviously have to reload, but you also become incredibly slow during that time, and you don't have anything else at your disposal whatsoever. I will say though, the mental games that you can play sometimes are great. For example, baiting survivors and making them think you're gonna shoot, which forces them to constantly crouch, making them slower, kinda like Huntress actually. All in all, you need a lot of practice to get things done with him properly, and he's certainly not as mindless as many other killers. I'll place him in the C tier just because he's a little more accessible than the D tier killers in my opinion. Next up, we have the Artist. Artist definitely takes a few matches for things to click. You can't just go into autopilot and expect things to flow smoothly. While she has really strong map control without a doubt, being able to pressure generators and reveal survivors through her crows, you can't just carelessly throw them. You have to carefully place them and predict survivor movements during chases as well. I think for a lot of people starting out with Artists, myself included, even if you manage to land a crow during a chase, hitting another one to actually injure the survivor feels like a 10 to 20% success rate at best, so you definitely won't be performing well immediately. Newer players might also instinctively spam crows, which I honestly still do, and that doesn't make things any easier either. There's a lot of on-the-spot planning involved, which might feel a little bit overwhelming at first too. I'd say she's great for learning how to think ahead, strategize, and read survivor movement, but her skill ceiling is definitely higher than it seems. She's very solid and rewarding once you get used to her, but she just takes some time, so she lands in the C tier for my accessibility list. We are almost at the end. The next killer I'll be talking about is the Demogorgon. I believe Demo has a really nice and simple balance in terms of power. You get a great taste of mobility with his portals, and honestly, you don't even need to use them perfectly to benefit from them. As long as you place them near important objectives, you can seamlessly rotate around the entire map and apply tons of pressure. He's also got a super nice dash that can be used during chases or even for extra mobility when flying off of higher ground with the shred. It's such a great combination. Nothing in his kit is outright complex. You fully understand what everything does, so you can jump right in and start playing without any confusion. Personally, I did sometimes forget though that I even had portals to begin with, or it felt like they needed to be in perfect positions, but they really don't. I also didn't realize that you actually need to stand on another portal to teleport as well, which is just me being dumb, honestly. As for the shred, survivors can bait you really easily, and the number of times I've fallen for that bait or had them turn sharply definitely messed me up. But it's not unforgiving at all. You can get right back up and right back at it. Overall, Demo is just another really solid killer in my opinion. I'll be placing him in the B tier. And now for the very last killer in the list, I'll be talking about the Nemesis. Nemi's power is super straightforward. You use your tentacle on survivors to infect them. The more the infection spreads, the stronger your tentacle attack becomes, with level 2 allowing you to actually break pallets and breakable doors with it, and level 3 giving you a boost to its range and your movement speed while charging it. It's an incredibly useful and basic power. Your zombies, if they happen to be positioned well, will lure survivors off of generators, applying even more pressure, so Nemi has many positives in my opinion. However, there are some negatives I'd like to discuss too. What I've noticed is that the hitbox of the tentacle is smaller than expected and is sometimes really difficult to hit. You really need to be patient with it sometimes. You sometimes also use your tentacle thinking it's going to hit a survivor, and then all of a sudden it doesn't, so you have to be pretty precise with it and patient like I mentioned before. He also doesn't have any mobility whatsoever to help him apply even more map pressure, and I feel like he can get pretty lost in the mix from what I've noticed. But overall, if you're good with the tentacle, you can shut down chases pretty easily and quickly. It's just that it needs a little bit of practice, but definitely not as much practice as some of the other killers require. Overall, he's another solid killer for beginners, so I'll be placing him in the B tier. The only thing working against him is that he doesn't have any mobility helping him apply more pressure, and I just feel like he isn't as oppressive from the very get-go or the first playthrough, if that makes sense. And that was the end of my list. I'd absolutely love to know your thoughts on everything I mentioned, and I truly hope I was able to maybe help someone out there pick a killer from this huge bunch that they feel fits them perfectly. Thank you all so much again for all your support and for 1,000 subscribers. I genuinely don't deserve you all. You all mean the world to me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon!